The pandemic we now face has exposed the fragility of our food economy.
Our interconnected world and current food system is actually very vulnerable for outbreaks like this.
Huge vulnerabilities exist when food has to travel long distances to get to our stores.
The COVID-19 restrictions on travel has intensified an already food system for my people. Transport is a huge barrier and options for healthy food is limited.
It has pushed many more people into starvation and left millions without livelihood opportunities. While there's an abundance of food surrounding the city, it has been difficult to get food to those who need it most.
The pandemic is exacerbating the vicious cycle of poverty and food insecurity. This puts greater pressure on the ecosystems that support the rural poor.
And the failures don't only affect everyday people, as we've seen in the supermarkets, but also the businesses that are running restaurants and purchasing ingredients for the hospitality sector. We've seen farmers dumping milk, harvests being left unpicked, but at the very same time we've seen lines and lines at the food banks.
So we've seen the food bank almost immediately having to service 2 times the amount of people that they otherwise did.
While food insecurity rates were already high, they have increased exponentially since the COVID-19 unemployment crisis hit.
People lost their ability to work the land, produce their own food and vegetables. They're completely reliant on government handouts.
Inordinate reliance on the public distribution system has destroyed the local economy, and people suffer from shortages and diseases.
It has really pulled back the curtain on our epidemics of chronic disease.
And then, of course, loneliness is a big issue aggravated through COVID-19.
COVID-19 has highlighted a need for increased resilience across all of our systems, and the food system needs to be at the heart of that.
We can co-solve for the pandemic and the triple crisis we find ourselves in now: a health crisis, an economic crisis, and an environmental crisis.
We aim to create a mutually beneficial culture for the health of both people and nature.
We see an opportunity in this to create jobs, restore ecosystems, and provide nourishing food for a self-sufficient Lebanon.
The Canadian prairies,
Brazil,
the Salish Sea,
in New York State,
Galapagos,
Chicago, South Africa,
Hong Kong,
India,
Nairobi,
Amsterdam,
Berlin, Brandenburg,
Australia, and the planet
by 2050.
Thank you to our Vision Prize visionaries for the work that you're doing and sharing your inspiring messages with us. Now I'm excited to introduce a few of these visionaries who have joined me to talk about how COVID is shifting their work and shaping their direction. They join us now. Dr. Elizabeth Kimani-Murage of Kenya has a vision to restore Nairobi to a place of cool waters. Paul Hanley has a 2050 vision for the Treaty 4 territory in Canada. And Veena Srinivasan has a vision to preserve India's rich cultural biodiversity. Veena, Paul, and Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Depending on which time zone you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So we'll dive straight into it. We have some very important questions and challenges to tackle today. This is a question, Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us about the specific food system where you are active? How has it been impacted by COVID-19 and how have you reacted to the crisis?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be in this panel and to talk about my food system. I am active in the Nairobi food system. Nairobi was once called a place of cool waters, and people often refer to it as the green city in the sun. But if you come to Nairobi, you realize that it's not necessarily a green city in the sun. It's not necessarily a place of cool waters. You'll find that majority of the urban residents in Nairobi actually live in slums, and these slums are overcrowded. The place is environmentally degraded, and people live in poverty. Unemployment is very high. High levels of food insecurity in this system. And about half of children growing in the urban poor settings in Nairobi are actually stunted. But in Nairobi, you find that there is a lot of obesity and diet-related diseases across the socioeconomic divide, despite having people who are stunted. And you find that also there is high levels of food, unsafe foods because of the food. Majority of people consume food that comes from rural areas, and this food has been often is grown with agricultural chemicals, harmful agricultural chemicals, and they are not used safely. So there is a lot of food unsafety in the urban poor in Nairobi in general. The COVID-19 pandemic has actually made the situation worse. Food insecurity has gone up because there are restrictions, and so many people, especially in the urban poor settings, have lost their jobs because many businesses have closed, and also because food supply from rural areas has been affected. So there is limited supply of food from rural areas, and this has meant many people in Nairobi are not able to access safe food and to access adequate food, and the urban poor are majorly affected. So prices have gone up and quality of food has gone down, and for school children are no longer in school, so school feeding programs have been stopped. And so many children who depended on school feeding to actually have a meal are not fed. So there have been many social protection measures from the government, by non-governmental organizations, from grassroots organizations. They have been distributing food, cash transfers, but this is not adequate and it's not regular. So people are still hungry. I've received many requests from people asking about whether we can support them to do urban farming, because they think that if they were doing urban farming, they would actually be able to feed themselves, because now they are not able to afford food, or they are not able to access the food. So that's generally what has been happening in Nairobi during this COVID-19.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing that with us and for your insights into how you have been impacted in Nairobi and how you've reacted. We're going to go over to you, Veena. Can you also tell us, in the specific food system you are active, how has it been impacted by COVID-19 and how have you reacted to this crisis?
Right. Thank you for having me. The food system that we've been working on is the Sikkim-Darjeeling region of the Eastern Himalaya. This is a picturesque, hilly, beautiful region with climate ranging all the way from subtropical in the foothills to almost an alpine tundra in the north. And it supports diverse ethnic groups, cuisines, and traditional crop varieties. Now, agriculture in this region was already vulnerable. It's largely rain-fed and unmechanized, and it was vulnerable to climate change, wildlife crop depredation, and fragmented access to markets. And what was already happening was a rapid replacement of traditional crop varieties by cash crops. Mass tourism was another major driver that was making farmers give up farming almost entirely, as tourism brought 10 times the amount of income compared to farming. Now, COVID-19 exposed the vulnerabilities of the food system and the trajectory that it was on. A survey conducted by the Eastern Himalaya office, available at csei.org, showed that many farmers were unable to access seeds and sow the pre-monsoon crop in April. The lockdown that followed cut off access to the wholesale markets in the plains, because the food was being transported from the hills into the plain and then back into the hills, which was a pretty crazy system if you think about it. And as a result of the lockdown, much of the produce ended up being wasted or sold at throwaway prices. At the same time, as tourism revenue disappeared entirely, a lot of the supplemental sources of revenue that the farmers were dependent on also went away. And overall, therefore, the survey showed that 95% of the households reported a very sharp drop in income. And although staple foods were being distributed through local agencies and civil society organizations, many households reported cutting back on fresh produce and having to reduce the number of meals. They still had to go and buy a lot of components of their meals, like spices and oil and so on. And that was really causing them to dip in savings. So overall, COVID kind of caused us to rethink the way we were thinking about primarily looking at responsible tourism as a driver for a sustainable food system, to really start thinking about the system as being more resilient overall and intervening both in terms of local demand and supply, in terms of shortcutting of some of the supply chains, as well as thinking more about regenerative agriculture and conserving the natural resources of the region. So I think that COVID-19 caused us to make a complete shift in our own way of thinking.
Veena, thank you. Thank you so much for that input. Paul, over to you. What has been the impact of COVID-19 where you are, and how have you reacted?
Well, the agri-food system here on the Canadian prairies is sort of a result of the colonial system that was imposed a couple of 150 years ago. And so we've created, the colonial forces cleared off the plains of the ecosystems and the indigenous populations, put them onto reserves, and created this very extractivist industrial type of agriculture. So we have a very small population here and a very large land mass. We produce a lot of food and export it. So it was very strange to go into the stores and find no, for example, we produce 500 million bushels of wheat in my province every year. I went into the stores, there was no flour on the shelves. And so that was kind of, I felt that the COVID-19 crisis kind of was a warning shot. I mean, generally speaking, we still had lots of food in most areas, but it sort of exposed the brittleness of the system. We export a lot of food, we import a lot of food. What happens when shocks like a pandemic come along, or issues around climate change, other environmental issues or economic issues? We could have a system with our long supply chains that really doesn't supply what we need.
Paul, thank you so much for that input. There's a question I so want to ask, and I'm going to come to that next. But as a food system visionary, Elizabeth, you are thinking and working to implement a range of solutions. Can you tell us briefly about the one that you see as really promising and that is inspiring you?
Thank you very much. I come to the issue of food systems from a justice perspective, from a human rights perspective, and I believe that everyone should have access to adequate, safe, nutritious food. And the problem we have is that food has been so commodified that it has lost its value. The people who actually produce it are actually hungry because they cannot afford the commodity that they have created. So the one thing that I would want to propose is to for Nairobi, because that's what the food system I'm working in, I would promote urban farming, innovative agroecological urban farming, so that people first feed themselves before they make food a commodity. And I would also propose a food rescue system where excess food, surplus food is actually shared and then redistributed to those who do not have food, so that everyone have access to food. So I would actually make food commons.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Paul, back to you. This is a question I hope we have a chance to ask all of you. But if you could go back and change one thing about our food systems 5 years ago to minimize COVID-19's damage today, what is that one thing that you would change?
Well, I think, what I see out there is that there are a lot of farmers, urban farmers and rural farmers, who are doing really exciting things, creating systems which are much more regenerative, I guess employing the ideas of agroecology to create a more resilient food system. And so what I'd like to, I guess, just see is our policies changing to support that kind of farming. I think payments to farmers, instead of based on typical types of subsidies, could become payments for ecological services, for a different type of agriculture. I think that would be a good way to go.
Thank you so much. Veena, coming back to you. If you could go back and change one thing about the food systems 5 years ago to minimize COVID-19's damage today, what one thing would you change?
Well, I was going to say more than one, a couple of things. I think that there are a number of things we could have done to reduce supply chain disruptions. And I think the first one I would say is community seed banks. So farmers wouldn't have to be dependent on hybrid seeds and not be able to buy them to save the pre-monsoon crop. The second thing is low-cost cold storage facilities at the village level that might have then allowed some of that produce to be to prevented it from going waste and increase its shelf life. And finally, just the existence of local markets instead of this dependence of transporting everything to wholesale markets in the plains and bringing it back. It really showed the vulnerability of farmers and consumers in the hills to supply chain disruptions and lockdowns. So I think those are the three things we would have liked to change, which would have minimized the disruption we see today.
Thank you so much, Veena. And Paul, just to hop back to you on this, can you tell us about the one solution in the range of solutions you're looking at that you feel is a promising one to implement?
Yeah, our vision is focused, I guess, more on the agricultural side. So again, I see farmers out there who are doing really exciting things in terms of reshaping their entire farm landscape to kind of model ecosystems. So reshaping the landscape in terms of adding tree cover, adding ways of managing water systems, crop rotations, much more diversity, and also selling directly to consumers. So this is kind of a very different model than the colonial model, the industrial model that really shapes most of our agricultural system. And I think it's much more resilient, brings better nutritious food, and really addresses, I think, the questions we're going to be facing in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Now, Elizabeth, over to you. 5 years ago, if you could go back, what thing would you change to minimize the impact of COVID-19? If you could change one thing about our food systems 5 years ago, can you think of one thing you would single out that could make an impactful difference to how we are experiencing COVID-19 today?
Okay, if you allow me, because I answered that question, could I answer as to what we plan to do?
Yes, please, your solution. Thank you, Elizabeth, and apologies for that.
Yes, so I want to see in the coming years, by 2050, I want to see Nairobi a healthy, beautiful, food secure, environmentally friendly place. So our solutions, we have two core solutions. We have several solutions, but I'll talk about two. One is urban farming. We want to do innovative agroecological farming in Nairobi. We know that the projections are that in 2050, Nairobi's population will triple. And the rural people living in rural areas, I mean, the rural areas will reduce because Africa will actually be more urban than rural. So we need to actually continue the culture of farming. The African culture of farming should not be lost through urbanization. We must return it. So I would want to promote that to ensure people have food, and we create jobs in the food system. And then, because a lot of food is wasted, I would want to promote a food rescue system whereby any excess food that is in the system can be actually recycled or can be redistributed, so that those who don't have food can actually be able to access food. So I would promote a circular system of production and recirculation of food. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Veena, and thank you, Paul, for your insights, your incredible solutions to these great challenges that we face within food systems. Now, given the time we have left, I'm going to ask you to answer one question, one final question. I'm going to start with Veena. Veena, what gives you hope that we can build a 2050 food system that is not only more resilient, but that is also more equitable, sustainable, and nourishing? Briefly, can you tell us?
Sure. So I think a resilient, equitable, sustainable, healthy future, it necessarily means a diverse portfolio of foods. I think that's what COVID has shown us, a combination of local and global, strong local food economies, even as we stay connected. And this requires two things that give me hope. First is during COVID-19, I think a lot of people have just sat at home and thought about food and cooking. And a lot of people have been forced to think carefully about what the industrial food system and the homogeneity of food, and look for local substitutes as imported supplies become scarce. And there's been a lot of interest in local cuisines and cultures and reviving them. The second thing that really makes it possible is the promise of technology in scaling diversity. So the Industrial and Green Revolution were agents, I think, of promoting homogeneity through economies of scale. And what the Information Revolution is allowing us to do is to actually scale heterogeneity. You see platforms like Airbnb, TripAdvisor, Uber Eats, all of these that are creating opportunities to aggregate millions of small producers and consumers and allow us to maintain diversity of tastes and supply. And I think both of these, the combination of demand and technology, is something that gives me hope.
Veena, thank you so much. We've got 2 minutes. Paul, over to you. What for you gives you hope that we can actually do this?
I think, ironically, the COVID-19 crisis actually showed us how much we can change, how rapidly we can change our economy, our food system, even our culture. So I think that we now have a vision of how rapidly systems can change if we really need to make them change. So that does give me hope.
Elizabeth, we've got 60 seconds. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that we are now looking at things from a human rights, increasingly. We are looking at things from social justice perspective, from human rights perspective. And if we do this, we are going to look at food from a different perspective. We are going to restore the value of food. So we are going to ensure that people are not commodifying food so that they produce food that they cannot afford. We are going to ensure that everyone can access food because food is a human right and everyone needs to access it. So I am very happy that human rights are being respected increasingly. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an incredible scope of answers, insights into your wisdom and experience, and showing us exactly why you have been named visionaries. Veena, Hanley, Paul, and Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us.